The valley wakes slow in October. Mist sits low over the cornfields, thick as wet wool, and Walter Hayes stands alone on his porch as the first light touches the ridge. Walter is 74. 40 years he spent reading the ground for a living, drainage, water tables, the old language of clay and stone most men forgot. His father kept a leather logbook, and Walter still reads it some mornings. Page after page of hand-drawn maps, every tile line, every spring, every vein of water hidden below. 2 gray SUVs come up the gravel road on a Tuesday morning, Spencer in the lead car. Clean boots, glass tablets, men who had never put a shovel in the dirt. They unroll their plans across Walter's porch table, 600 acres next door, a glass and steel automated farm rising where his neighbor's cattle once grazed. Walter taps one spot on the blueprint, the hollow quarter, where his father's notes mark a thin clay shelf over standing water. That ground breathes, he says. The young one, Spencer, smiles the kind of smile that costs nothing. Our model rates the bedrock at 10 times the load, Mr. Hayes. We're covered. Walter doesn't argue. He just screws the lid back on his thermos and watches them roll the blueprints up, careful not to crease the corners. If you've ever watched people with more money than sense ignore good advice, stay with me. Walter is still watching. Subscribe if you like stories like this one. November brings the bulldozers, Spencer watching from the road as they peel back topsoil that hadn't been turned in 60 years, dark and wet, steam rising where the blade cuts through. Concrete trucks line the gravel road by the dozen while Spencer walks the grid himself, calling out numbers to his crew, his voice thin against the wind. Their soil sensors come back clean. Spencer calls the clay layer stable himself, the bedrock solid, the whole site rated and approved within a week. Walter watches from his fence line most evenings, says nothing to anyone. He writes the date, the weather, what he sees, in his own plain notebook. Steel cages of rebar drop slow into deep pits, lowered by crane, Spencer watching from the edge as workers guide each one by hand into the wet dark below. The first concrete pour happens on a still, cold afternoon, Spencer watching under the floodlights as men smooth the gray surface flat before the frost can take it. A week later, Walter notices the old maple at the edge of his land starting to lean, just slightly, toward the new site next door. Walter checks his well one morning. Water that ran clear his whole life comes up faintly cloudy, the way it never had before, not in 50 years. He says nothing to Verdant Dynamics. He just writes the date, the color, the faint smell of wet limestone rising where it shouldn't, not on ground this dry. By December, glass and steel towers rise over the cornfields, Spencer watching them glow through the night like something that fell out of the sky and landed wrong. Inside, robotic arms move along steel rails, irrigation lines hum, water dripping steady onto rows of green that never once see real sun or real rain. The rain starts hard in early December, Spencer checking the site one last time before the first real test for ground that had carried nothing heavier in 100 years. Spencer finds a hairline crack near the loading dock himself, shrugs it off, calls it normal settling, the kind every new pour shows in its first winter. Walter walks the fence line at dusk, crouches near a patch of damp earth that has never once flooded, and just breathes it in. The second rain comes harder, 3 days straight, soaking deep into ground that hadn't carried this much water since his father was a boy. Underground, pressure builds against a shelf of clay no thicker than a barn door, holding back water that has waited there for 10,000 years. The new foundation sits its full weight exactly where that shelf runs thinnest, though no one building it has any way of knowing that yet. Inside the control room, Spencer watches a pressure reading climb past anything in the system's memory, no history to compare it to, no alarm built for this. An engineer calls it a faulty sensor, resets the reading instead of walking outside to look, and goes back to his coffee without a second thought. Walter's well pump groans one cold morning, pulling air instead of water for the first time in the 50 years he's owned that handle. That night, under hard rain, Walter feels the ground near his fence line tremble low, a sound no one inside the tower can hear over the constant hum of the machines. At first light, Spencer finds the crack split wide enough to swallow a boot, water already rising slow and steady through the gap beneath his feet. Inside, Spencer watches the pressure alarm finally fire, lights flashing across a panel built for numbers no engineer ever expected to see climb this high. Spencer orders the tower cleared. Workers stream out into the gray morning as the structure leans, slow and silent, toward the lower field below it. Walter hears the commotion from his porch. He picks up the phone, makes one quiet call to the state inspector's office, and goes back to his coffee. By mid-morning, inspectors in muddy boots walk the site slowly, with handheld probes, reading numbers the automated system never once thought to check. Walter shows them what his father mapped 60 years before, a confined vein of water, breached now by the weight of new concrete above it. The damage didn't come from outside. It rose up slowly from beneath, quiet and patient, exactly the way the old logbook said it would. State engineers confirm it within the week, while Spencer watches from a distance. The foundation isn't sinking at all. It's floating, lifted by pressure, no model accounted for. The same gray SUVs come back up the gravel road, Spencer riding in one of them. No tablets this time. Just men in plain coats carrying folders nobody opens. The fines arrive before the cranes do. Violations written for breaching a protected water table that had sat quiet under that field for centuries. Taking the tower down takes longer than building it, Spencer watching from the road as cranes lift each steel section by hand-guided cable into the creek's edge. Spencer never comes back to the site. The reports get quietly revised weeks later, somewhere far from the valley, by people who never saw the crack. By spring, Walter walks through the hollow quarter again, churned earth and broken concrete waiting patiently on trucks that take their time getting there. Walter walks the fence line one more time, presses his palm flat against the old maple, standing straight again like nothing ever leaned on it. Walter's well runs clear again by April, the same quiet way it always had before anyone thought to ask the ground for permission. That summer, Eli, his grandson, finds the old leather logbook sitting on the kitchen table, asks what all those faded lines and marks really mean. Walter doesn't lecture. He hands Eli a small trowel, tells him the ground always tells the truth, if a man's patient enough to listen. The valley settles back into its slow rhythm, Walter standing once more on his porch, mist low over the fields at dawn, the same way it has for 100 years.